So today on the podcast, we're going to take a look at the recently published book, After Disney by Neil O'Brien. On our podcast, we have a unique format for talking about books. As always, I'll read a section of the book to you. This time I'll read Chapter 1, so you can hear how language, pacing, description, and narrative work in this particular book. Think of this as an audio version of picking up a title at a bookstore and then exploring its first few pages. And in this book, the first chapter sets up most of the title's themes and main figures. This is the story of the Disney company's struggle to continue with animation and later to expand live action in the years after Walt's passing. It's the story of the family feud that plays out between Walt's descendants and those of Roy. It's the story of how Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller, tries to remake the company with stronger attention to the tastes of contemporary audiences. It's also the story of how Michael Eisner and Frank Wells essentially push out Ron Miller. And perhaps more than anything else, this book is the story of how Disney Animation tried to remake itself in the 1970s and 1980s with a focus on one of the most controversial features to ever come out of the studio, the Black Cauldron. It does all that, and it's a fascinating read. But before I jump into After Disney, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, and these here are the people who make this whole show possible. It takes a lot of time, effort, and resources to put this show together each week, and these are the people whose contributions make all of that possible. I'm grateful to each of our Bandcamp subscribers, but a special note today is going out to new subscribers: CHD 9594, G. Greiner, Disneyland Thomas, Gary, and Susan. Thanks to each of you and to all of our subscribers for supporting this podcast. And now we're going to shift back our calendars to December 1966, to the day that Walt died. In ways, the Disney company's story from 1923 to 1966 is mostly a single story focused on Walt and his vision. After 1966, it becomes many stories with people looking for the best way to move animation, the parks, TV, and various live-action film projects forward. And now I'll read for you the first chapter from Neil O'Brien's fabulous book, After Disney. And once the chapter's over, we'll talk with the author about his thoughts on how this book was put together. Enjoy. At 9:30 a.m. on December 15, 1966, at St. Joseph's Hospital directly across the street from his Burbank studio, Walt Disney lost his battle with lung cancer. He had just turned 65 a few days earlier. News of his death quickly spread across his empire. Within minutes, Walt Disney Productions Vice President Don Tatum called Orban Melton, the president of Disney's theme park design group WED Enterprises, to break the news. The men sat in stunned silence, unable to find any words to convey their grief. Minutes passed before either could hang up. "It's such a tragic thing," Melton wrote later that afternoon. "It seems that he was just on the threshold of building the biggest dream I think a single man has ever dreamed," referring to Walt's plans for Disney World, which included a utopian, experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot, as well as other projects like Mineral King, a ski resort, and the further expansion of Disneyland. Walt's employees were utterly devastated. The only thing that came close to that, and it didn't really come close, was the assassination of JFK, recalls Floyd Norman, the studio's first black cartoonist, who got to know Walt well that final year while working in the story department on The Jungle Book. That day we were kind of thunderstruck, wondering what the hell had just happened. It was a sense of disbelief, the sense of shock. It was watching grown men walk to the parking lot with tears in their eyes, literally watching people weep at the Disney studio. Phones at the Disney studio were ringing off the hooks, with inquiries from around the world. When a French journalist called for confirmation, the studio scrambled to find someone who could translate the press release. They hadn't appreciated that the grief over Walt's death would be felt so widely and so personally. For years, Uncle Walt had been a staple in people's homes via Disney's weekly television show. California's then Governor-elect Ronald Reagan, who was also one of the TV hosts for Disneyland's 1955 opening, said, "The world is a poorer place now." Walt's brother and lifelong business partner, Roy O. Disney, took Walt's death as hard as anyone. According to biographer Bob Thomas, Roy believed Walt had a good chance of making it, even just hours before he died. It made the sting of death that much harder. It also threw off Roy's plans to retire. He was now 73 years old. The prospect of Walt Disney Productions without its founder and namesake was troubling to investors. In an interview where Walt mused about a world after Disney, he said, "As well as I can, I'm untying the apron strings." But if secession was on Walt's mind, he left little evidence. In the minutes after his death, Disney stock plunged about 5%. Rumors were flying about possible takeovers. In a rare move, the New York Stock Exchange temporarily halted trading of Disney stock. It would be among the most uncertain moments in the history of the stock, eclipsed perhaps by a hostile takeover attempt nearly 2 decades later. Roy had to quickly assemble a statement to reassure investors. It read, "It was Walt's wish that when the time came, he would have built an organization with the creative talents to carry on. We will continue to operate Walt Disney's company in the way that he has established and guided it." When trading resumed, Disney's stock rebounded. Roy's statement laid out the company's future priorities: film and television production, and the expansion of the theme park business. What was missing was any specific reference to the future of animation, once the core of the business. When Walt Disney moved to California in 1923, he operated his modest cartoon studio out of his uncle's garage. His business grew exponentially as his films gained popularity, notably with the introduction of Mickey Mouse in 1928 and the first animated feature Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. Walt started to branch into hybrid live-action animation films in the late 1940s, Song of the South in 1948, So Dear to My Heart in 1949, to help his studio rebound from World War II. But animation was still the heart of everything. The studio lot in Burbank, built after the success of Snow White, was designed around the animation process with an underground corridor connecting the animation building where the characters were drawn with ink and paint where they were painted and readied for filming. Things began to change in the 1950s after Walt released his first non-animated film, Treasure Island. He continued to expand into live-action movies, television, and in 1955 he opened Disneyland. By 1966, animation was a small part of the larger film and television portfolio, which itself represented less than half of the company's annual income. Around the time of Walt's death, films accounted for under 48% of the company's annual income, Disneyland 35%, and the rest was largely divided between television, music, and merchandising. Animation was an expensive, time-consuming venture, and success was rarely instantaneous. After more than 2 decades and 3 releases, the animated film Bambi from 1942 had finally earned about $8.6 million. By contrast, the Haley Mills comedy That Darn Cat from 1965 earned $9 million in its first release, proving live-action films could be just as popular as animation and made with far less time and expense. With Walt gone, his brother Roy had to figure out how to keep Walt Disney Productions moving forward, including who should lead the film division. After conferring with Walt's widow Lillian, Roy offered the job to Walt's close aide, producer Bill Anderson. Anderson, a decade younger than Walt, grew up on a ranch in Cache County, Utah, and moved to Hollywood in 1929. He abandoned his dreams of becoming either an actor or a lawyer and instead worked for Firestone in production management. During World War II, he joined Disney to help with production control. In due time, Anderson rose through the ranks from associate producer to the board of directors, and he was responsible for one of Disney's biggest live-action hits, Swiss Family Robinson, in 1960. In the wake of Walt's untimely passing, Roy offered Anderson the role of production chief, but it came with an unimaginable request. "Bill, when you finish the picture that we're working on, the Jungle Book, I want you to close up feature animation." Anderson objected. "Roy, that's the most valuable thing we have." He understood animated films differentiated Disney from other studios. Roy insisted, "Nobody could make feature animation pictures but Walt. I want you to close up feature animation." "Roy, I won't do that unless you write me a memorandum." There was silence between the two men. Anderson continued, "I couldn't do what you're asking me to do. You have to write it because I don't think people would understand." Walt's passing was shock enough. Shutting down animation so soon after his death would compound the trauma. Anderson needed to make the case to keep animation alive. He invoked Walt. "We already have an idea of what the next one will be, and Walt has been in on it roughly," he said. He was referring to the Aristocats, the story of a family of cats set to inherit their owner's fortune. It had been originally conceived by longtime Disney executive Harry Title as a live-action project, but he and Walt later agreed it would work better as a cartoon. As early as 1965, the Aristocats was announced as the next animated feature after The Jungle Book. Anderson was hoping Walt's initial green light was enough to convince Roy. Anderson said he didn't approve the story, but he did approve it as a project. He tried to push his luck with Roy. "I'll go ahead until I hear from you." With that, Anderson put the matter back in Roy's hands. If Disney Animation was shutting down, Roy would have to be the one to do it. Anderson knew he bought the animation department sometime, but he didn't know how much. With the fate of Disney Animation now in question, the Aristocats took on new significance. It would be the first animated film without Walt's direct involvement. It needed to be a success on its first release. In the decade before Walt's death, Walt Disney Productions released only 3 full-length animated features: Sleeping Beauty in 1959, 101 Dalmatians in 1961, and The Sword in the Stone in 1963. Sleeping Beauty was particularly expensive due to its larger-than-life 70mm widescreen format, and when it didn't recoup its cost, the animation department was hit with layoffs. The Aristocats could not afford to follow that model. Two weeks after Walt's death, in the week between Christmas and the New Year, Bill Anderson assembled a creative team to discuss the Aristocats. The huddle included key members of the animation department: Ken Anderson, Larry Clemens, Vance Gary, Dick Lucas, and Wolfgang Wooly Reitherman, as well as screenwriters Bill Walsh, Don DeGrady, and producer Winston Hibbler. This assembled team, responsible for Disney's most treasured films from Cinderella in 1950 to Mary Poppins in 1964, were trying to sort through the film's characters, who they were, what their names were, what they did, and how many. "You've got too damn many cats," one of them offered. "You need a dummy, you need a dopey, you need a cat that gets into trouble, a bad kid," another suggested. "Certainly they have them in well-bred families as well, don't look at me." They could still crack jokes despite the seriousness of the assignment. The meeting concludes with the decision to continue building out the personalities and letting the story take shape from there. What is remarkable about this story meeting is not just the free exchange of ideas, but how little Walt was discussed. Just 2 weeks after Walt's death, no one mentioned anything along the lines of, "What would Walt have liked?" or "What would Walt do?" Disney's storytelling was so ingrained in and largely defined by this group that they weren't entirely paralyzed by Walt's absence. With Walt's ever-expanding portfolio demanding his attention, they had grown accustomed to his absences. When Walt was referenced, it was only to contextualize earlier conversations. For example, when the men started to discuss the era the story takes place, one chimed in, "Walt just said, why don't you make it around the turn of the century sometime?" The turn of the century coincided with Walt's childhood, and it became an endless source of inspiration. It was the backdrop for films like Lady and the Tramp, so dear to my heart, Summer Magic, and Pollyanna, as well as Disneyland's Main Street USA. As presented by Disney, this age is conflict-free. The bumpiest ride on Main Street is a horse-drawn trolley. It is altogether fitting that the final animated film to receive Walt's blessing would be set during his favorite era. Producer Harry Title is not listed as an attendee of this late December 1966 story meeting, but the transcribed conversation shows he may have been there for at least one awkward moment. After much back and forth over how to streamline the story, one of the men said, "Harry, we're not talking about challenging the whole story. It's a matter of degrees." Sometime around this meeting, Title was moved off the film. He wrote in his memoir, "My grief over Walt's passing was heightened by the pain of losing my project, like offspring adopted from me without my consent." Given the abrupt nature of Walt's death, Roy Disney formed an executive committee of Walt's lead advisors to take charge of the studio's creative decisions. It consisted of some of those involved in that early meeting shaping the Aristocats: Bill Anderson, Bill Walsh, Winston Hibbler, as well as Harry Title and art director James Algar. None of the animation department veterans, known as the Nine Old Men, were included. The committee was rounded out by 2 junior members of the Disney family, Walt's son-in-law and Roy's son, Roy Edward Disney. The group reported up to Disney's VP of Marketing, Card Walker. The effectiveness of the committee setup would later be questioned, but in the uncertain period after Walt's demise, it allowed for checks and balances in an era where other studios were gambling away fortunes. Walt was a once-in-a-lifetime visionary, and his empire was so tied to his persona that it seemed no individual could replace him. However, Walt had hoped his beloved son-in-law could take over Walt Disney Productions when the time was right. Of Ron Miller, Walt once said, "I have great ambitions for him. He'll run the studio one day." Walt seemed to see more potential in Ron Miller than perhaps anyone else. 5 days after Walt's death, Ron Miller was placed on the Disney board. More than a decade later, Walt's dream of Ron taking the helm as president and CEO of Walt Disney Productions would come true. Ron Miller was born into a working-class family in April 1933 in Los Angeles. His father, John, was born in Trail, Canada in 1905, more than a decade after the frontier city's initial gold rush. Ron's mother, Stella, was originally from Kentucky. Both made their way to California looking for better opportunities. For John, that meant steady employment at the Goodyear plant. For Stella, it meant odd jobs working at Hoffman's Chocolates, and later as a cheese wrapper at a grocery store. The family lived close to John's job at the Goodyear plant, and growing up, Ron would go see Santa hitch a ride on the company's famous blimp. John Miller loved the mythology of the West, a mystique reinforced by the movies. When the Millers had a second child in 1936, they named him John Wayne Miller, even though the Duke was still a B-picture actor who hadn't yet starred in Stagecoach. John Miller instilled in his sons a love of adventure and the outdoors. As an adult, Ron was able to fulfill his childhood dreams of being a cowboy at the Disney family's Diamond D Ranch in Wyoming. As a kid living in the shadow of Hollywood, young Ron loved going to the movies. Though Westerns were the family's favorites, Ron was coming of age as Disney animation was in its prime, with movies like Pinocchio and Snow White. "Well, I grew up on Walt Disney," he once said. "I had seen everything he had made." As he matured, Ron displayed innate charisma and athleticism. He would occasionally be confused for a matinee idol like Rock Hudson. Floyd Norman remembers, "The young Ron Miller, we're talking movie star looks. The women wanted to be with him, and all of the men wanted to be him." The statement belongs to a different era, but in a way so did Ron. He was the seeming embodiment of a certain kind of idealized 1950s American youth, which Life magazine dubbed the luckiest generation. To put it another way, he was Disney's Prince Charming in the flesh. In high school, Ron excelled at math and could compute complex problems in his head. Still, he was more of a jock than a star student, and he could often be awkwardly quiet. He had a brash high school football coach who helped him get a scholarship to college. The coach called USC, demanding they help pay for Ron's tuition, or else he'd make sure Ron got into rival UCLA. It worked. Ron was accepted and attended USC on a football scholarship, just as his hero, John Wayne, had more than 25 years earlier. At USC, Ron majored in commerce and was known as Mr. 88, his jersey number for the USC Trojans. At 6'4", 204 pounds, Ron was built for football. His USC teammates included future NFL cornerback Lyndon Crow, future Disney executive Dick Nunes, and Al Baldock, who later mentored John Madden. One of the biggest games of USC's 1953 season was against rival UC Berkeley on October 24th. 78,000 fans packed the stadium, including hundreds of USC students who made the trek up to Berkeley. California played a messy game, fumbling the ball more than a half dozen times. USC took the lead and held it, despite California's attempts at a comeback. The victory was so lopsided that Ron's third-quarter touchdown almost seemed gratuitous to the reporters covering the game. The final score was 32-20, with USC prevailing. As triumphant as that day was for Ron, the next few hours would change his life forever. After the win, Ron's teammate and close friend, Tom Nikoloff, arranged for a double date with Tom's girlfriend's roommate. Her name was Diane Disney. Diane Marie Disney was born to Walt and Lillian Disney on December 18, 1933. On the day of Diane's birth, Walt was nervously awaiting word of his daughter's arrival while receiving an award from Parents Magazine for his distinguished service to children. He was only half listening to the flowery and heart-throbbing speech extolling his films because he was keeping an ear out for the possible call that his wife was in labor. Just as Walt was beginning his acceptance speech, an attendant whispered good news in his ear. "This is the biggest moment of my life," Walt told the crowd. "You'll pardon me, I'm sure, if I run away and show this beautiful medal to my wife and—" With that, Walt sped off before the audience knew quite what had happened, rushing to the hospital for Diane's birth. From the start, Walt was smitten with his baby daughter. He laughed at her little hiccups and marveled as she counted her tiny fingers and toes. She was a good-natured baby who doesn't cry, according to Walt. He would brag about her light-color hair and her big brown eyes, which resembled his mother's. "Well, I used to laugh at those poor mutts who thought they'd got the only baby in the world," he told a reporter. "Now I know. She's the swellest baby you ever saw." After Diane's birth, the Disneys wanted more children. Their hope was to have a large family, but Lillian suffered multiple miscarriages, and ultimately they decided to adopt the child. Diane's sister Sharon was welcomed into the family 3 years later. Walt was a loving father who loved to entertain his daughters. For Christmas 1939, Santa delivered a cottage in their backyard, which was built to resemble the same Germanic fairy tale influence as Snow White. It had a sloped roof, a bay window with curtains, running water, and a white picket fence. When the girls entered the child-sized house that Christmas morning, the phone rang. The girls picked up the call and found Santa on the other line asking how they liked their new place. On weekends, the Disney studio became the girls' playground, where they were free to ride bicycles along Mickey Avenue or Dopey Drive. Sometimes Walt's films didn't get the reaction from his daughters that he expected. Walt took 5-year-old Diane to a private screening of Snow White, and when the evil queen transformed into the old crone, Diane started crying. She was whisked outside. Walt later used the story to say the film wasn't meant for small children, but instead the child inside every adult. Similarly, when he showed preteen Diane rushes of Song of the South, she found some of the scenes to be overly emotional and corny. Walt rarely watched dailies with Diane after that. Still, he couldn't help sharing all of his ideas with his daughters over family dinners, held after he got home from his 14-hour workdays. Diane appeared in one of Walt's early television specials called 1 Hour in Wonderland, but she never had much desire to join the family business. At USC, Diane was a member of the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority and formed a close group of friends. The women dubbed their 3-story house Theta Land. Theta had the distinction of being the first sorority at USC, dating back to 1887, with the mission of offering social, intellectual, and moral growth for its members. Diane fit in well. She was intellectually curious and studious and loved the arts. She was also a dynamo, a small but tough woman, strong-willed and adventurous. On weekends, Diane and college friends would travel the West to ski or cheer on the USC Trojans. That October 1953 night, when Ron and Diane met, they did not hit it off. When they joined their friends at a Bay Area dive bar, Ron ordered a shot of bourbon, thinking, "I'm going to get in the mood." However, the day's excitement caught up with him, and he began to shut down. Diane, turned off, signaled to her friend that sleepy Ron seemed to be a square. Even though Diane thought Ron was nodding off, he saw her hand motions. Realizing the date was not going well, he excused himself to the bathroom. He went back to the hotel and fell asleep without saying goodbye. The following day, it was time to head back to Los Angeles. Ron saw Diane at the train station, and he apologized for his sudden disappearance. On the ride home, they ordered beers and got to know each other better. Their second, unofficial date proved far more successful, and they began a whirlwind romance. Exactly 2 months later, on Christmas Day, Diane invited Ron to a family party. Ron was nervous about the prospect of meeting the legendary Walt Disney. "I could hardly talk. Here's this great guy who's probably one of the most talented people in Hollywood back then, the most celebrated, respected, and everything else. But Walt quickly put Ron at ease. He was just as warm and humble as anyone. His Midwestern roots came right out, and he made me feel comfortable, and Lily made me comfortable, and they accepted me. It was really a great relationship. Ron and Diane weren't exactly sure why Walt and Lillian took such a keen liking to him. The 21-year-old Ron was not very articulate around them, according to Diane. He would also dress extremely casually, walking around barefoot in Bermuda shorts. Nevertheless, to Walt and Lillian, Ron seemed like a godsend. I think that Diane had been out with so many duds that I was a ray of light, Ron joked. A few weeks after Christmas brunch, Walt and Lily started asking Diane when Ron was going to propose. Ron and Diane's courtship became all-consuming, and they left their academics fall by the wayside. Within 6 months, Diane was pregnant. They were married on May 9, 1954 at All Saints by the Sea Episcopal Church in Montecito. The best man was Ron's brother, John, and the maid of honor was Diane's sister, Sharon. Ron's USC football teammates were also in attendance. Walt walked Diane down the aisle, and when it was time to answer the minister's question, "Who gives this woman to be married?" Diane saw tears on Walt's cheeks. The reception was filled with laughter, love, and a healthy amount of champagne. Walt surprised the couple with a comical cake topper, the bride figurine attired in USC gear, and the groom in Bermuda shorts. Walt, Ron, and Diane laughed gleefully at the gag, and those in attendance could see the mutual affection between father and son-in-law. Now that Ron was part of the family, Walt hired him to drive documents back and forth between the studio in Burbank and the Disneyland construction site in Anaheim. However, Ron's career at Disney was put on hold shortly thereafter, first by the Army and then by the NFL. Ron was drafted and stationed at Fort Ord in Carmel, where Ron and Diane's first child, Christopher, was born. Walt had hoped his first grandchild would be named after him, but Ron admits he was very ornery about the request at that time. When the couple had their second son, the fifth of 7 Miller children, Walt finally got his wish. Diane would remember their early days in Fort Ord as some of their happiest. Even though she and Ron lived in small and simple accommodations, Diane was excited to be starting a new life with her husband and their new baby. The simplicity of their home was happily complemented by the natural beauty of Carmel. "It was a wonderful point in her life," said her son, Walter Disney Miller. "She always looked back on it fondly." After leaving the Army, Ron joined the LA Rams. As a rookie, Miller looked to have great potential as an offensive end. In an exhibition game, he made an impressive diving catch on a 40-yard pass. However, his football career was plagued with injury. "Walt saw me play a couple of games," said Ron. "One game I fractured my ribs, and the other game I had a concussion." "You're gonna get killed out there," Walt told his son-in-law. "I am too damn old to raise my grandchildren. So why don't you come work for me?" Ron also thought Walt was worried that life on the road would not be good for their young family. That, compounded with the Rams' 4-8 losing season, was all Ron needed to change career paths. Now that Ron was at Disney full-time, Walt got Ron into the Directors Guild, and he was made second assistant director on Old Yeller. Jobs followed on Mickey Mouse Club and Zorro. He even directed Uncle Walt in an intro for Disney's weekly TV show. "Talk about being nervous," Ron said. His shoot with Walt went about as poorly as one could imagine. The novice director decided to change blocking, keeping Walt stationary the entire time. But when Walt came in, he wanted to stick to the original plan, which involved a more dynamic movement between the two parts of the set, the bookshelf, and Walt's desk. Ron hadn't lit those positions, so it took a half hour to rework the lighting. When film was finally rolling, a rumbling truck drove by. The noise was so loud it could be heard on the soundproof set. It seemed to happen on every damn take, just as Walt was in the middle of the take. Adding to the gremlins of the day, the teleprompter also went out. Miller later called it the most frustrating spooky day I've ever had in my life. You can just feel Walt on edge. It was the last time he directed his father-in-law. Walt encouraged Ron to give up directing and focus on producing. Producers could focus on multiple projects at the same time, and at Walt Disney Productions, the producer typically exercised more control than the director. Walt also began training Ron on how to run the studio. Father and son-in-law would arrive at the lot early in the morning to watch as employees showed up. As each person drove up, Walt explained who they were and what they did. Ron was also taken under wing by producer Bill Walsh, who had worked on many of Walt's live-action hits, including Mickey Mouse Club and The Absent-Minded Professor. Bill was 20 years older than Ron and referred to him as Kid. They became good friends. Walsh taught Ron a lot about production, including managing a budget. When projects came along, Ron would try to team up with Bill whenever possible. As much as Walt loved Ron, he grew frustrated by his son-in-law's shyness, particularly in story meetings. Walt complained about it to Diane, and in turn she told Ron, "Dad thinks you ought to open your mouth." Ron embraced the feedback and started speaking up more. It delighted Walt to see Ron become more aggressive and grow into the role of producer. Ron was like a blank notebook, Diane would later say. Dad would take and mold him in his pattern. Dad was able to give the man I married something that he loved to do that he could be uniquely qualified for. It was almost too good to be true that the situation worked out that way. Ron appreciated the family bond that developed with Walt and Lily. Lily was a great mother-in-law. They were both great grandparents. They loved my kids. Walt would spoil his grandchildren every Christmas, giving each child the latest Disney merchandise. Walt was often able to outshine Santa with better toys. "I say this in all honesty," said Ron. "It was just a great relationship. I so admired the man. He's a real person. His values were phenomenal." Ron was also keenly aware of one of Walt's greatest frustrations, the increasing limits placed on him by the Disney brand. Whereas the rest of the film industry was pushing the limits with increasingly mature themes, violence, obscenities, and sex, Disney films were reliably safe and family-friendly. Even though Walt believed deeply in making wholesome entertainment, he also began to feel like he was in a creative straitjacket, one he had tailored for himself. His daughter Diane later said he was really beginning to get tired of films by the 1960s. There were exceptions like Mary Poppins in 1964, which allowed Walt to use all the tricks of his trade, special effects, animation, audio animatronic figures, and music. Even though it became one of the top-grossing movies of all time, Walt saw Mary Poppins as a unique achievement, not a template for future films. "We're not making another Mary Poppins. We never will," Walt said. "Magic is only magic once upon a time." At one family movie night at Walt's private screening room, Walt ran Universal's 1962 film To Kill a Mockingbird. "What a fine picture, what a great story, and a great cast," remembered Ron. "From top to bottom, it's about as perfect a motion picture as you can come up with." Yet, as the lights came on, Walt seemed distressed. He was tapping his finger and said, "God, I wish I could make a film like that." Walt's envy of Mockingbird makes particular sense in the context of its young heroine, Scout, who is not radically dissimilar from the child protagonist of Walt's films. Yet thematically, the story was unlike anything Walt had previously tackled. Well, it had content that he couldn't touch, and he knew it, explained Ron. The film was released at an inflection point in the civil rights movement, in the window between James Meredith's enrollment at Ole Miss and George Wallace's Segregation Forever speech. Even if he tried to make a message movie about one of the most urgent issues of the day, Ron said, Walt felt the public would reject it coming from him. He was sorry he couldn't do it, Ron said. But he had to live up to his reputation, and he had to protect it. And obviously he was right. He did what was right. In the post-war era, Walt had cultivated a non-controversial family brand, but it had become something so inflexible that a then-contested topic like civil rights or even the hint of innuendo was off-limits. In 1962, the same year as Mockingbird, Disney released the Technicolor travelogue comedy Bon Voyage. The film looks at the romantic relationships of a happily married American couple and their adult children as they travel abroad. In one section, the father is propositioned by a well-dressed French prostitute. A few moments later, he finds the same woman trying to pick up his wannabe playboy son. The scenes are so vaguely scripted that some viewers may miss what is happening. Still, audiences at the time objected. That was a disaster, Walt told reporter Bob Thomas. You should have seen the mail I got over it. I'll never do it again. Walt's takeaway was that sex is a very private matter for most people. They feel uneasy and uncomfortable when they see it portrayed in public. Walt had once thrived on being able to surprise movie audiences with something they didn't know they wanted, like Fantasia's 2-hour symphony featuring dancing hippos. Now, though, his audience wanted to be delighted but not challenged. The Mockingbird screening and Walt's frustration with the Disney brand would stay with Ron long after Walt was gone. By 1966, the professional and personal bond between Ron and Walt was strong as it ever had been. That year, Walt shared an Emmy Award nomination with his son-in-law for an episode of his weekly show, The Wonderful World of Color, called Gallagher. When asked about the joint nomination, Ron downplayed its significance. Still, it shows Walt's commitment to boosting his son-in-law's profile. On a family trip to Vancouver in the summer of 1966, Walt's physical deterioration was becoming obvious to Ron and the rest of the family. Walt had trouble moving around, needing to pick up his leg to get in and out of a boat. The family assumed it was the polo injury acting up. It wasn't until the exploratory surgery in November that they knew Walt was seriously ill. As Walt recovered from the surgery, Ron updated him on the studio's latest film, Follow Me Boys, which was doing solid business at Radio City Music Hall in New York. The film would go on to break house records at the famed theater, as 27,000 people came to see it, paired with the Rockettes' Christmas show the week before Walt's death. Walt liked the film a fair bit, but did not expect it to be the last one he'd live to see released. As Walt was recuperating from surgery, his doctor warned him that he would need to cut back at the studio. His 14-hour workdays were no longer possible. Ron believed Walt intended to hand off film production to a creative committee, like the one Roy later assembled, so he could focus on the projects that mattered to him now, specifically Disney World and Epcot. As Walt's health deteriorated, Ron and Diane were a constant presence. He spent his final Thanksgiving at their house surrounded by his family. Shortly after, he checked back into the hospital for what would be the last 2 weeks of his life. Ron stopped by regularly. During one visit, Walt introduced him to a nurse as his son. The nurse corrected him. You mean your son-in-law? No, Walt objected, my son. Ron thought it was the greatest thing ever said to him. Ron and Diane arrived at St. Joseph's Hospital on the morning of December 15th. As we got off the elevator on the floor, I saw Ron go striding into Dad's room and then come out with his arms up like that, as though someone pushed him back, recalled Diane years later. He was gone. Walt's brother Roy was at the foot of the bed, massaging his feet. Diane remembered her uncle saying his goodbyes. Well, kid, this is the end, I guess. The next day, the family held a private funeral for him at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Walt had wanted a simple ceremony. Instead of flowers, the Disney family asked people to support the California Institute of the Arts. Walt hoped to create a new educational and cultural institution where artists could not only learn but collaborate across media. This, along with Epcot and Disney World, would be his legacy. And again, Walt was right. CalArts would go on to produce future leaders in the arts, specifically in the field of animation. Well, he said if he could live for 15 more years, Ron remembered, he would surpass everything he had done in the 40 years previous. In his will, Walt left nearly half his estate to the development of CalArts. Ron said Walt's death was the end of something that will never be seen again. It was now up to Ron and the others to carry on as best they could without Walt. There was a tremendous void, an emptiness, said Ron. Life after Disney. And now we'll shift our focus over to the author, Neil O'Brien, where we'll talk about the book, what he learned had been left out of the Black Cauldron, how his book works to rehabilitate the reputation and work of Ron Miller, and also what he has to say about a curious little project that has always fascinated me. Specifically, Michael Eisner's interest in creating an animated feature where the story is somewhat similar to the classic American novel Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, only with dogs as the main characters, not boys at prep school, and also without having secured film rights to Catcher in the Rye from its publisher. I should also point out one more thing. Long-time listeners here know that every spring during allergy season, I typically lose my voice. And well, the levels of pollen were wildly high when we recorded this a little over a month ago. Still, Neil has some fascinating stories to share, so let's kick into all of that now. So much has been written about the time of Walt and Roy Disney, and so little has been written about the time after Walt and Roy passing. And your book fills in that missing part of the history extremely well. So I wanted to start here. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in the history of the Disney company.
It's sort of been a lifelong interest, to be honest. So I'm a journalist, as you know, in my adult life and my professional life, but Disney fan going back since I was a kid. When I was about 10 years old, I went to a mall in New Jersey where a Disney animator was giving a talk, and we were seeing rough pencil animation of what would be this new character in this new film coming out, and it was Ruben Aquino was the animator, and the character was Ursula, and the new film was The Little Mermaid.
Mm-hmm.
So at a very young age, I was sort of very much aware of the process of animation, and that there were these great artists like Ruben Aquino who were behind these movies. And it was at a time where Disney was about to release not just Little Mermaid, which at that moment seemed like, you know, how can you top that? But then 2 years later, Beauty and the Beast, and then Aladdin and Lion King. So I was sort of undergoing my like own sort of awakening at the same time that the Disney Renaissance was happening. So it was always sort of a lifelong interest, and you know, also just interested in film generally. And in about 2008, it was sort of the DVD era, and every film, whether it was a classic, and not just Disney, but you know, every classic film, every mediocre film, every bad film, we're getting these elaborate behind the scenes making of supplemental features, and yet there were these almost like, several Disney films where the story behind the story I felt was not getting explored in a way that was satisfying my curiosity. So I just started what would eventually become 17 years later, the book after Disney.
So that kind of leads into one of the questions that I had. So there are so many areas of
Yeah.
focus in your book. There's the kind of saving animation after Walt's passing. There's the career of Ron Miller. There's the clash between the Roy E. and the Ron Miller sides of the family. There's the making of the Black Cauldron book. But I'm guessing, and I could be wrong here, that one of these stories was the entry point into this project, and the other things blossomed out from there.
Yeah, and I would say it probably started as an exploration of the Black Cauldron, but even at the beginning, I knew that the arc of that production incorporated much of those other pieces. Ron Miller was the executive producer of the Black Cauldron, and yet Roy E. Disney ends up with his own credits on the film. And so I knew that I knew enough about the story going into the research phase that I knew it would be rich. I think, if anything, what it was a long process, 17 years. I think the first sort of chunk of that journey, I probably had a magazine article maybe. And it wasn't until I sort of broadened it out even further, and I was sort of missing a beginning as well, which we could talk about, but I didn't quite have the gap of that 5 years between Walt's death and around the time the studio acquires the Cauldron series, the books, the Prydain books. And so ultimately, a little bit of additional research down the road got me a starting point of that project closer to 1968, which is just months after Walt's death, where Otto Englander wants to explore this property, the Prydain Chronicles, for animation, hoping that it could be the kind of life and death story, high stakes film that would bring them back to his first animated film he worked on, which was Snow White. And, he was there at the beginning. And so he wanted to sort of recapture some of that glory at the end of his career. And anyway, so once I sort of had that beginning, then that sort of let me explore even in more depth the immediate aftermath of Walt's passing.
Yeah, so at some point in your research, you got a chance to come out and to talk with producer Joe Hale.
It was about 2009. I spoken to him already, but then we went out to visit him. He had a beautiful house. I remember there were hummingbirds in his grove, and at that property, he actually had like when he left the studio or when he was building this house, he had like some of the iron gates from Mary Poppins incorporated into his house, and a statue kind of piece from Something Wicked This Way Comes. So his house was sort of adorned with all this Disney history. And yeah, I stayed in touch with Joe in 2015. He invited me to come out for the El Capitan screening of The Black Cauldron. So anyway, Joe at one point was going to be perhaps even more of a central figure, and he is important in the story, but he comes in a little bit later in the book.
Yeah, so you got to see through him a copy of one of the work prints before Jeffrey Katzenberg takes a knife to it. What are some of the, you talk about this in the book, but what are some of the
Yeah,
elements that were removed from the work print before it
yeah.
was released?
So as I was just referring to, so we went to visit him in 2009, and as we were, he showed me all this amazing art from all these artists he'd worked with at Disney throughout his career, and including pieces he had from Tim Burton when Tim Burton was working on Cauldron. And as we were ending our visit, I noticed that on his shelf he had this VHS tape, and it said TBC Work Reel 9.1 to end. And I said, "What's that?" And so I was able to screen. It's really just, I would probably characterize it as the last third of the film as it was intended. It's all rough animation, but it has both dialogue and sound effects, not final score. And ultimately, for all the sort of mythology around what was cut out of the Black Cauldron, the truth is it's all sort of small potatoes things, but those little cuts, the original material was just a little bit richer throughout. There's a little more pathos, a little more drama in the scenes. The only scene that was sort of cut out, perhaps for violence or for scary imagery, is has since been, there's some cells of it online, which is sort of one of the Horned King's henchmen, his body melts away, which Phil Nibbling animated. But beyond that, it's very like it's minor things. It just adds a lot, especially during the climax of the film. One example is when they bargain with the witches. All the characters offer the witches something to bargain with, so all the characters are still there. There's a little bit more to romance scene with Elanwe and Taran, where she's encouraging him to believe in himself. It goes on a little bit longer, and it just feels a little bit, again, like slightly richer, but importantly so. And again, at the end, when the witches give Taran Gurgi back and he's seemingly deceased, Taran really feels pain and he's upset and he has guilt almost about what happened to Gurgi. And so when Gurgi comes back to life, it's all like little things. It's just in its totality, it just becomes a slightly richer film, at least in my estimation.
So, at least as I understand it, and feel free to correct me here, but one of the internal battles that happens during the production of the movie, many years, is whether this should be more like a Walt era picture or something like the furthest thing from a Walt era picture. Do you think it would have been more successful if it was like earlier Disney animated features, or do you think it would be more successful if it was even less like earlier Disney animated features? Because when I watch it, I see like both design pulls happening throughout the picture.
Well, I think you're probably asking more specifically in terms of design and story. Am I right
Yeah.
there? There was a point in around 1980, 81 kind of range, I think, where they had tasked Tim Burton and Andreas Deja, both amazing artists, obviously, in their own right, to come up with character designs for the film. And Tim Burton's stuff is not just characteristically Tim Burton, but when they were developing the museum exhibit that's since traveled around, the art of Tim Burton started at MoMA. MoMA views his work on Black Cauldron as really transforming him as an artist, which is interesting. So his work, is very strange, it's wonderful, especially so different than everything we've ever seen from Disney. The problem is there was concern from management that if it was probably too idiosyncratic, it's hard to make Tim Burton's art able to be, put on model, so to speak. At least that's how management felt at the time, right? And
Mhm.
so they ultimately present it to Ron Miller, and it's like, do you want to go this direction, which would be radically different? Or Andreas Deja, on the other hand, seems, according to Joe Hale, at a young age, just seemed to have the Disney style flow from him naturally. And so they sort of viewed it as an either or proposition. There were attempts to try to merge the two styles, and either way, you sort of lost the charm of the original. And so they eventually move in a more traditional Disney style. I don't know if it in that time period, if it had looked radically different. I don't know, but in terms of what would have been more successful, I think the other important thing to remember with Cauldron, and this is something that Ron Miller made a point of talking about twice. We had like two conversations that came up both times, was they were losing the audience, especially in the early 80s. G-rated movies were seen as something that only 6-year-olds go to, and if you're lucky, their parents. And so Disney really struggled, especially in the post-Star Wars Hollywood, to find its audience. And the story that Ron shared with me twice was this moment in 1962 where Walt was doing a private screening of Universal Pictures To Kill a Mockingbird, and Ron Miller and the family are with Walt, and Ron Miller thinks it's about as perfect a film as you can get. And the lights come on, and Walt's visibly frustrated, and he says, "I wish I could make that movie, but I can't because the public would not accept that from me. It's 1962. The country's violently divided over civil rights. And Walt feels like a movie like To Kill a Mockingbird was not something that could be a Disney film, even though if you step back for a moment and you see the heroine Scout, a young female protagonist, very much could be a Disney style character. That frustration with Walt's brand that Walt felt back in 1962 was something that stayed with Ron throughout his tenure leading the studio. And so with Black Cauldron, throughout its production, Ron wanted to try to make it a more mature animated film because he felt that the child audience was sort of limited and he wanted to try to win back teens and young adults. And so that's why Cauldron really leans into its PG rating, or at least tries to. So would it have been a more successful film if it had been a G-rated film, and leaned more into the traditional fantasy elements and maybe less into the sort of dark fantasy that it presents? Maybe. But at the time, Disney was sort of struggling with all its films to stay relevant in the marketplace, especially by the late 70s, where you had family films that were PG rated, that were pushing the envelope a bit, whether it is Star Wars or even films like Grease or Bad News Bears or Superman, that were just a little less safe and sanitized than what the public felt Disney films were in that era.
Yeah, so for me, a lot of the 70s films feel like 1950s films, and they aren't connecting to the post-youth culture revolution 1960s, 1970s audience. The North Avenue Irregulars, which is kind of this zany, this zany caper movie with musical songs at times, comes out like 2 weeks apart from The Deer Hunter, which is this brutal post-Vietnam drama. And so, could you talk a little bit about that? Because you do in the book about
The North
how,
Avenue Regulars.
well, about how Ron Miller starts to push the company away from more North Avenue Irregulars, which I actually really enjoyed when I was young, and
Yeah.
Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo and stuff like that, and towards more sophisticated projects that might have had a more meaningful commentary for contemporary America.
Yeah, and one note that I actually didn't even realize until I went to a Tribeca Film Festival talk from Steven Spielberg about Sugarland Express, which is if you watch Disney movies from the 70s, everything ends in a vehicular chase. And what I didn't really understand, because it's just a few years before my time, is that before Star Wars, car chases were movies. And when you put it in that context, everything from like the French Connection to Smokey and the Bandit to everything else, you sort of understand why every Disney movie in the 70s seems to have a car chase in it. So that's my little defense of the North Avenue Regulars, which is a cute enough movie. Anyway, but to your point about Ron Miller and trying to move the films in a more mature direction, again, they were looking at the box office, and especially after Star Wars, they see that like the audience just does not want to go to a G-rated movie, and that's been their bread and butter. So they have to figure out what to do. So he tries a number of films, and again, it's like it really moves in a bunch of different directions. You have everything from the Black Hole, which is easy to sort of see as a Star Wars wannabe film. That it's interesting because people were feeling frustration, critics especially with the Disney brand, and you see people like Siskel and Ebert sort of use the Black Hole as a time to then express their sort of overall frustration with the Disney brand when that one comes out. But then you have kind of some attempts at the horror genre with something like The Watcher in the Woods, Betty Davis, and then you have a teen comedy where they try not to even use the Disney brand in the title, Midnight Madness. And then you have films like Trenchcoat and Condor Man that kind of try to hit some kind of comedy spy genre, but sort of geared towards adults, but with kind of a very slapstick sensibility. So you just see Disney experimenting in this time period. And it's easy to sort of, I think we tend to think of Disney a lot when you're thinking about film and Hollywood. For some reason, it's easy to put Disney in its own vacuum. But this is the time period where William Goldman said nobody knows anything. And so much of Hollywood was sort of struggling to find the audience at that moment. Most studios had more films to play around with. Disney at this point is releasing only a handful of new films a year. But, with exception of maybe Paramount, where Michael Eisner was during this time period, and Barry Diller and Jeffrey Katzenberg, Paramount is pretty successful throughout this time period. But other Hollywood studios are also experimenting and failing and flailing, trying to figure out what is going to work with this audience that has you go from the 1960s and Walt's time period, you sort of have one major evolution in Hollywood with what some critics call the American Renaissance in film, where you have, films like The Godfather and The Graduate and this more mature storytelling, but very director driven. And then you end up again with a second revolution with Spielberg and Star Wars, or this new Hollywood and the blockbuster. So all of a sudden, in the span of just 10 years, you have two major evolutions in filmmaking, and a lot of studios are trying to figure this out. Anyway, so back to Ron. Tom Wilhite is brought in with Ron, and he is a really influential figure as well. And Tron comes out of this time period, which is we're about to see the third in the Tron series later this year. But that's a bold attempt at bringing computer animation into really, it's basically the star of the film, even though the actor is Jeff Bridges. The star is the computer animation of that film. So anyway, so Ron keeps experimenting until the point where he decides that rather than keep trying to push everything out as a Disney film, he will create a new label, and that new label for films is Touchstone. The first Touchstone film is a big hit. It's Splash. Gave the world a movie star named Tom Hanks, gave us a major film director in one of his, not his first film, but one of his biggest early films, Ron Howard. Major hit, sort of the big box office hit that Disney had been looking for a long time, and basically more than a decade. And then the second film, which doesn't get as much attention, especially these days, but is important, especially to that sort of Mockingbird, To Kill a Mockingbird callback, was this movie Country. This was Jessica Lange's passion project. She, at that point, was one of the most in-demand Hollywood stars. She had just been nominated and won an Oscar in the same year in two different categories. And she was in a sort of public relationship with a playwright, Sam Shepard. And so she was like a Meryl Streep and a Marilyn Monroe all in one. And she wanted to make this film about what was happening in Middle America, this farm crisis of the 1980s that was happening outside of the media centers of New York or LA, to shine light on what was really a very traumatic time for a lot of farmers, where they were losing their family farms, foreclosures. It was leading to some really heavy situations personally for people, not just bankruptcy, but also suicide. The film also shows, instances of domestic violence and alcoholism, all sort of rooted in this socioeconomic collapse happening in Middle America. This was Jessica Lange's passion project, and it was Touchstone's second release. And this really is like the social issues picture that Walt felt he couldn't do 20 years earlier. Ron Miller is able to do it as the second Touchstone film. So in many ways, between Cauldron, which came out the following year in 85, Splash, and Country, you sort of have this unofficial Ron Miller trilogy of films that were trying to push Disney in a new direction. And I think with Touchstone and Disney now being sort of expanding its corporate umbrella, you now have a company that can then later house everything from a ESPN to a Nat Geo to a Pixar to a Star Wars, because it's not just sort of core Disney anymore. My point of view is that really is because Ron Miller remembered how Walt felt, when they were when they were just having a private moment in the family. He saw that it was okay to actually move the corporation forward by expanding what kinds of movies Disney could release.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really admire about your book is that it rehabilitates and recontextualizes Ron Miller's contributions to the development of the Disney company. Because so many times in books, I feel that it's presented that Ron Miller is the person that needed to be moved out of the way so that Michael Eisner and Frank Wells could come in. And a lot of things that I think that Michael Eisner typically gets credit for are more started with the Ron Miller era. So I've also got a personal interest question for you. So I
Sure.
was so delighted to see that you brought up the Project Doofus. Because
I could have done more on Doofus, to be honest, but
I
I,
want to hear
I
about
had to,
Doofus. So I know about this a little bit from Joe Hale. And
yeah.
so Doofus is this attempt to J.D. Salinger, the author of Catcher in the Rye, is not going to sell screen rights to anybody for his famous novel. And so Michael Eisner has this idea that they could do kind of like a close adaptation using dogs. And also, this seems like the perfect Michael Eisner project. Walt Disney was repeatedly drawn to small town stories, and Eisner is drawn to the big city stories. And this is a story about kids at an elite all boys boarding school. And he wants to see how far he can kind of push it to be a Catcher in the Rye-ish thing without not necessarily getting sued for it. But Joe Hale is convinced they're going to get sued for this, and he's going to called in to testify at some point. So, what did you learn about this project when you talked to Joe Hale about it?
Well, you actually have summed it up pretty well, to be honest. The other thing that's worth noting is that when Michael Eisner comes in, this is one of his, ideas for animation. And Catcher in the Rye, I think, was one of those properties in Hollywood in this time period that, especially at a studio like Paramount, you would have been attracted to figuring out how to crack the code of getting the rights to it. But, some of his other ideas was to take the Beatles music or Cats, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats, and using that to make like the secondary Fantasia. So Michael Eisner was, he animation was all new to him, but he was trying to figure out how to take the things that interested him and maybe turn them into animated films. So Doofus is part of that. The one thing I haven't been able to quite connect in my research, but it's at least logical to me, is that out of Doofus, then you wind up with a dog film and
Oh
adaptation
yeah,
set in New
absolutely.
York, which is Oliver and Company.
I
But I
see
haven't
those two as
quite,
deeply connected.
yeah,
Yes.
I just haven't found like the moment where Pete Young takes a Doofus and hears about Doofus and decides, you know what, I'll just spin this slightly differently and we'll do Oliver and Company. But yeah, it was Doofus. I mean, I have a story synopsis and I don't remember it all off the top of my head. I have to pull up my notes. But it's basically Doofus is a young dog in the city and he goes to obedience school and he's kicked out of obedience school. And yeah, and so it's gonna mimic at least major plot points of Catcher in the Rye. And it didn't, I think what happened, at least what Joe Hale told me, is and we lost him earlier this year, which at the age of 99. But what he told me was he thought the idea was terrible, and he eventually I don't he eventually talked about it publicly in one of the trade publications, and I think it was sort of mocked after that, and so they decided to shelve it and not move forward with it. And yet, it definitely shares the same DNA with Oliver and Company.
And the Doofus Project, if I understand it correctly, from the J.D. Salinger book, Holden Caulfield, who's the main character, has a younger sister, and Doofus also has a younger sister that that he's very connected to as well. So it seemed like it was very kind of point for point going down to how this.
Yeah, I mean, it was meant to skirt the IP problem as close as you could without getting into major trouble. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me close with this. So, your presentation of this time period has such rich and interesting stories. There's like a few other books out there about this time period, like Storming the Magic Kingdom, but not really a lot. So, why do you think that so few authors and historians have not dipped down into this material before?
Yeah, and I mean, I could do a whole separate question about Storming the Magic Kingdom, but I did reach out to the author of that book because he documented the boardroom events of 1984, and all his notes are gone now, and a lot of those players are gone now, and so his book is really almost like as close to real-time reporting as you can sort of rely on. So he John Taylor was very generous with sharing his work to sort of inform my work. So I appreciate that a lot. I think it's a tricky time. The hero of my book in many ways, or one of my main subjects, is Ron Miller. And he was forced to resign in 1984. And, it was a very painful event for him. He did not participate in storming the Magic Kingdom. He's one of the only people who didn't. So his side of the story really had never been told before. And, I think that he was reluctant to speak about the events of 1984. So in many ways, it would be an incomplete history. I think that's part of it. I also think that Disney had a lot of success after the fact, so it's sort of easier to focus on Walt's time period so much because you had that amazing trajectory from the Alice cartoons all the way through the Jungle Book. It's almost a straight line of success with, some detours here and there, but you have that amazing story. And then it's sort of easy to pick back up with sort of a clean story of 1984 and beyond. And you do have something like Waking Sleeping Beauty, where the time period I'm writing about is really maybe just the first act of that before they get into all the success that came with the Disney Renaissance. I don't know. I think it's partly because failure is an orphan, but I don't necessarily view this time period as a failure. I view it as really the through line that gets us from Walt to the success that we saw later. I don't know. I also think, history is written by the victors a lot of times. And I think it's easier to focus on some narratives for some books than others. And I don't know. I just think it's a really rich time period. I think Ron Miller's career gave us so much that we don't even fully understand. Turning Epcot, with the creation of Epcot, we saw a new way for Americans to spend a full week of vacation and their hard-earned leisure time and their hard-earned leisure money away from like maybe a long weekend at the Magic Kingdom and with some resorting and maybe go to somewhere else in Florida, to people now wanting to spend their precious time and money inside a Disney bubble. So much of that is because Epcot expanded Disney. You see home video flourish, the beginnings of that under Ron Miller, and that brought Disney movies into people's homes growing up whenever they wanted to watch it on demand. And I think that changed people's relationships, not only with Disney, but with animation. With Ron Miller, you see the animation department reborn not once, but twice, both, as a passage from the Nine Old Men to a new generation, but then also after Don Bluth leaves, a second time around rebuilding it. And from that time period, we now have a billion-dollar animation industry that's not just Disney, but also Pixar has its roots to this time period. And even DreamWorks, its rival, has its roots in this time period. So there's so much happening at Disney. I didn't even talk about computer animation and Tron that was happening. And global theme parks, not just Tokyo Disneyland, but the early explorations for Disneyland Paris happened under Ron Miller. So there's all this, there's a lot that was happening. There were struggles, there was big swings and misses, but there was a lot of good and a lot of future-looking things happening under Ron Miller. If anything, I think Ron Miller, because of his mentorship under Walt, I think he took the long view a lot of times, and that may have led to his downfall a little bit. With Walt, he learned that, a film like Bambi, it might take 3 releases over the course of 20, 30 years before you saw a profit on Bambi, but it was okay because it was going to come out again, So a film like The Black Hole, when that failed, it would be okay because it'd be part of the bigger Disney library. Epcot, big, expensive project. Disney took on a lot of debt to get that built, and it was going to be a major success down the road. But in the short term, it probably hurt Disney in the fall of 1983 when quarterly earnings came out. And so anyway, Ron was looking ahead a lot of the times. Not that he was necessarily, I don't think he would ever claim to be the visionary that Walt was, but he was sort of thinking big picture, thinking long term. And I think perhaps a weakness of his, though, was that because he was trained under Walt, he was not trained in sort of the world of Wall Street and what Wall Street would become in the 1980s. And so when corporate raiders made a play for the company, I do think he was out of his element at that point. And he tried his hardest to keep the company intact, which he did. But ultimately, the board felt that he wasn't the right person to keep leading them, especially at a time where people who were willing to sell the company in parts had a credible attempt at sort of taking the company away from the current leadership. So, I don't even know if I answered your question anymore, but I think this time period is very rich. And I just think that because it's a little thorny at times and a little complicated at times, and not everything's just success, that I think that maybe that's why people don't explore it as much.
Yeah, well, I think you did a fabulous job with it. I enjoyed reading it.
Well, thank you.
And I think it's just an amazing collection of stories and conflicts and clashes that all explain how we got from the Walt era to pretty much where we are now. And so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming in today and talking with us. I appreciate it very much.
I appreciate you having me.
You can find Neil's book, which is called After Disney, over on Amazon as a paperback, a Kindle edition, or an audiobook. If you're looking for a summer read, I think most listeners will have a really good time going through it. I'll also leave a link to it down in the show notes today. And over on Bandcamp, we've just put together 3 new albums, which collect up multiple episodes that tell longer stories about the history of the Disney company. If you open an album on Bandcamp, you'll find that inside of it are multiple episodes, so you can listen to the whole story without interruptions, like an audiobook during your commute, while walking, or while on a long drive or flight. We've been putting up albums over on Bandcamp for years. Just look for or search for the word album in the title. But the 3 albums that we just stitched together are The Yippie Invasion of Disneyland, in which political protesters and hundreds of police back in 1970 faced off inside of Disneyland, the legendary Rolly Crump, which tells the life story of the famous Disney artist, largely through interviews I did with him 20 years ago, and lastly, the Ballad of Dick Nunis, who was one of Disney's key people who oversaw and changed the parks after Walt's passing. Those and many other albums are now streaming on the Bandcamp website or on the free-to-download Bandcamp app. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.